Most people think the answer to visceral fat is simple. Eat less, move a little, and eventually it'll melt away. And that's what everyone tells you. Just cut your calories and be patient. And yes, that works, but only up to a point. The data actually shows something that flips this whole idea on its head. Caloric restriction has a ceiling. There's a limit to how much visceral fat you can lose just by eating less. And once you hit that ceiling, your body starts fighting back. It starts defending itself against further fat loss. This isn't laziness or a lack of willpower. It's biology. It's an ancient survival mechanism built into your body. Your body reads fat loss as a threat, not as progress, so it slows everything down. Your resting metabolism drops. You start moving less without even noticing it. Your body temperature can dip slightly. And that hunger, that constant food noise in your head, gets louder and louder. So no, starving yourself is not the answer here. If you actually want to target visceral fat, and I mean really target it, you have to stop thinking only about subtraction. You have to start thinking about addition, because there are very specific foods that interrupt the exact biological signals that create and maintain visceral fat in the first place. And when you pair the right foods with the right kind of movement, something interesting happens. The results become dose-dependent, which means the more of these signals you send your body, the faster and more dramatically visceral fat disappears. And this changes the entire way you should be approaching this. Visceral fat isn't just extra belly fat sitting there for storage. It's fat that wraps itself around your liver, your pancreas, your intestines, and your other internal organs. And unlike the fat just under your skin, visceral fat is metabolically active. It behaves almost like its own organ. It constantly releases inflammatory chemicals into your bloodstream, and those chemicals disrupt your hormones. They interfere with how your body processes sugar, and over time, they create a self-feeding loop that raises your risk for type 2 diabetes, heart disease, certain cancers, and even dementia. So in this video, I want to walk you through the exact protocol, the specific foods that target visceral fat through 3 distinct biological mechanisms, and then the exercise strategy that acts as a multiplier on top of everything else. And I'll show you the research behind how some people have cut their visceral fat by nearly half in just a matter of weeks. And if you're new here, I'm Dr. Amelia Stone. I'm a double board certified physician, and on this channel, my entire mission is to hand you real science and practical tools so you can live longer and actually feel better while doing it. Quick disclaimer before we get into it. Even though I'm a physician, I'm not your physician. So please talk to your own doctor before changing anything about your diet, your exercise routine, or your overall health regimen. This video is for education only. It is not personalized medical advice. So let's get into why this protocol actually works. It works because it goes after the 3 specific mechanisms that keep visceral fat locked in place. And the first one is chronic inflammation. Visceral fat isn't a passive storage tank sitting quietly in your abdomen. It's active. It's inflamed. The fat cells themselves are constantly releasing inflammatory molecules called cytokines, things like TNF-alpha and interleukin-6. And this creates a vicious feedback loop. The fat drives inflammation, and that inflammation makes the fat even more resistant to being broken down. So in a strange way, visceral fat protects itself by staying inflamed. But here's the good news. When you bring that inflammation down, you break the cycle. And once that cycle is broken, your body can finally start mobilizing and burning that stored fat. There are 2 levers I want you to focus on here, because you need both of them working together to actually break this cycle. The first lever is omega-3 fatty acids. And one of the best foods for this is walnuts. Walnuts are loaded with polyunsaturated fats, especially alpha-linolenic acid, or ALA, which is a plant-based omega-3. And omega-3s go directly after those inflammatory signals coming out of visceral fat. They calm the whole system down. Another excellent source of omega-3s is fatty fish, things like salmon, sardines, and mackerel. These are rich in EPA and DHA, and beyond fighting inflammation, they also improve insulin sensitivity and support a healthier liver, which matters a lot because visceral fat and fatty liver tend to go hand in hand. The second lever is polyphenols. And walnuts actually show up here too. Walnuts aren't just an omega-3 food. They're also loaded with polyphenols. And these compounds work through a completely different pathway. Polyphenols change how your body handles and burns fat, essentially nudging your metabolism to favor burning energy over storing it. There was a fascinating randomized controlled trial that illustrates this perfectly. Researchers compared 3 separate groups. One followed a standard healthy diet. One followed a traditional Mediterranean diet. And the third followed what's called a green Mediterranean diet, a version that's even richer in polyphenols. Both Mediterranean groups ate a small handful of walnuts every day, about 28 grams, or roughly a quarter cup. But the green Mediterranean group added a few extra things on top, including green tea and a daily plant-based shake, while also cutting back further on processed and red meat. When the researchers measured visceral fat using MRI scans, The green, polyphenol-rich Mediterranean group lost almost double the visceral fat compared to the standard Mediterranean group. And here's the part that should really stop you in your tracks. Both groups were eating the exact same number of calories. The only difference was the type of food. Same calories, dramatically different results, because the composition of what you eat changes how your body processes and stores that energy. Now, most of us don't have easy access to some of the more exotic ingredients used in these studies. But in practical terms, the takeaway is simple. Push your diet in a more polyphenol-rich direction. Add leafy greens, add berries, add walnuts, add extra virgin olive oil, which we'll come back to later. These are accessible, affordable ways to get the same biological signal. Now let's talk about the second mechanism keeping visceral fat locked in place, and that's insulin resistance. When your body becomes resistant to insulin, your cells stop responding to it the way they should. So your pancreas compensates by pumping out more and more insulin, trying to force that excess glucose out of your bloodstream. And chronically elevated insulin directly promotes fat storage, especially the kind that wraps around your organs. This is exactly why people who are insulin resistant tend to accumulate visceral fat disproportionately, even when their total calorie intake hasn't actually changed. So anything that improves your body's response to insulin is going to make it significantly easier to clear out that visceral fat. There are two standout foods here, and they work through two completely different pathways. The first is broccoli sprouts, and honestly, this might be the single most underrated food on this entire list. Broccoli sprouts are packed with a compound called sulforaphane. This compound activates a pathway in your body called NRF2. Think of NRF2 as an internal control center for inflammation and oxidative stress. When it's switched on, it activates an entire network of genes that protect your mitochondria and reduce inflammation at the cellular level. And there's more. Sulforaphane also signals your liver to slow down a process called gluconeogenesis, which is when your liver manufactures its own glucose. So you're getting better blood sugar control from two directions at once. Why broccoli sprouts specifically, and not just regular mature broccoli? Because sprouts contain anywhere from 20 to 100 times more sulforaphane precursors than the fully grown vegetable. A small handful of sprouts can deliver more benefit than an entire head of broccoli. Most people do well with about half a cup a day, ideally eaten raw, tossed into a salad, or blended into a smoothie. One important detail though, sulforaphane clears out of your system fairly quickly, so it's better to eat a small amount every single day rather than a big batch once a week. As for where to find them, some grocery stores carry broccoli sprouts in the produce section, usually near the herbs and microgreens, but availability can be hit or miss depending on where you live. The good news is they're incredibly easy to grow at home. All you need is a mason jar and some broccoli sprouting seeds, and you'll have a fresh batch in about 5 days. There are plenty of simple tutorials online, and growing them yourself costs a fraction of what you'd pay at the store. Broccoli sprouts aren't the only food that helps with insulin signaling. Dark chocolate is another one, but it has to be at least 85% cacao to actually count. Berries continue to show up again and again in this kind of research, and don't overlook fermented foods like kimchi and sauerkraut. All of these have solid evidence behind them for improving insulin sensitivity, and each one works through a slightly different biological pathway, which is exactly why variety matters here. Now let's move on to the third and final mechanism. We've talked about breaking the inflammation cycle, and we've talked about correcting insulin signaling. But your body also needs a clear signal to actually start burning the fat that's already stored. And this is where extra virgin olive oil comes in. The polyphenols found in olive oil activate two specific pathways in your body. The first is called AMPK, which functions basically like your body's internal energy sensor. When AMPK is activated, it tells your cells to start pulling energy from fat stores and burning it as fuel. The second pathway is called SIRT1, and this one improves how efficiently your mitochondria operate, particularly in your muscle tissue. So it's a two-part effect. Your body gets the signal to burn fat, and it actually becomes better and more efficient at doing it. There was a double-blind randomized controlled trial published in the European Journal of Nutrition that demonstrated this exact pattern. Researchers compared extra virgin olive oil against soybean oil. Both groups ate identical calories, and both were in the same calorie deficit. The result was striking. The olive oil group lost 80% more body fat than the soybean oil group, and this was with just 25 milliliters a day, roughly a tablespoon and a half. Same calories, same deficit, completely different outcome, because the olive oil was actively telling the body to burn more fat. And that's really the deeper lesson buried in all of this research. The quality of your calories can lead to dramatically different outcomes even when the calorie math on paper looks identical. So that covers the nutrition side of this protocol. But if you take it one step further and layer in exercise, that's when your results start to compound. This is genuinely how people manage to lose visceral fat in a matter of weeks instead of months. There's an important nuance here, though. A large meta-analysis that pooled together 84 separate studies compared nearly every major category of exercise to see which ones actually reduced visceral fat most effectively. And the clear winners were exercises done at a higher intensity, specifically vigorous aerobic exercise and high-intensity interval training. There was a study published in the journal Diabetes Care that really drives this point home. In this study, the protocol was just two 45-minute cycling sessions per week at a moderate to vigorous intensity, plus one additional interval training session, so 3 total sessions per week. That protocol reduced visceral fat by 48%, nearly cutting it in half in just 8 weeks. On top of that, the intervention group also lost 18% of their subcutaneous fat, the fat just under the skin. Now, this was a relatively small study, but the direction of the results lines up consistently with much larger analyses. And here's something else from that study that I find fascinating. The participants lost nearly half of their visceral fat, but their body weight on the scale barely moved. This is something I tell my patients constantly. We cannot live and die by the number on the scale, because it's actually a pretty poor way to measure real progress when it comes to visceral fat specifically. So if you're doing everything right and the scale isn't budging, that does not mean it isn't working. Most of these studies define moderate to vigorous intensity as somewhere around 40 to 60% of your maximum heart rate reserve. A lot of fitness trackers and smartwatches can calculate this for you automatically. But keep in mind, heart rate isn't always a perfectly reliable measure. If you're on certain medications like beta blockers, your heart rate can run artificially low, which throws off these calculations. Devices like an Apple Watch or a Garmin will often give you heart rate zones to aim for, with moderate intensity landing around zone 2 and vigorous intensity around zone 3 or 4. But these zone definitions aren't standardized across every manufacturer, so take them as a rough guide rather than gospel. Honestly, the simplest way to track this, and it's what I personally recommend to patients, is the talk test. You know you're in moderate intensity territory if you can still speak in short phrases or sentences, but you're noticeably a little winded. Another way to think about it, you can still talk, but you couldn't comfortably sing. Now, all of this might sound intimidating, especially if structured exercise hasn't been part of your routine. But moderate intensity does not mean sprinting or exhausting yourself. For a lot of people, especially beginners, this can simply be a brisk walk, walking uphill, or cycling at a steady, sustained pace. In the studies that showed the strongest results, participants didn't start out at full intensity on day one. They gradually built up over several weeks, sometimes even months. So the goal is to progressively work your way toward higher intensity, not to jump straight into the deep end. Jumping in too fast is exactly how people end up injured and quitting altogether. And if you have any underlying heart condition, please talk to your doctor first to figure out what intensity level is appropriate and safe for you, because everyone's situation is different. In practical terms, all you really need is 2 to 3 sessions a week, around 45 minutes each. The specific type of exercise matters less than you'd think, as long as you're incorporating real intensity into it. And arguably even more important than intensity is consistency. A slow, steady 20-minute walk done every single day will outperform one exhausting 60-minute workout done once a week. And here's the piece of research that really changes the entire equation. There was a study published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine that found something remarkable. With exercise, the more you do, the more visceral fat you lose. It's a dose-dependent relationship. But with caloric restriction alone, researchers did not observe that same pattern. There's a ceiling to how much benefit you can get from cutting calories, but there is no ceiling to how much benefit you can get from movement. So no, you do not need to starve yourself to lose visceral fat. Focus on adding the right foods we talked about today. Aim for a modest, sustainable calorie deficit, and if you want to accelerate the entire process, pull the lever on aerobic exercise and intensity. That's really the whole protocol. To bring it all together, remember there are 3 mechanisms working against you when it comes to visceral fat: chronic inflammation, insulin resistance, and a lack of clear signaling to actually burn stored fat. Walnuts and fatty fish calm inflammation through omega-3s and polyphenols. Broccoli sprouts and foods like dark chocolate, berries, and fermented vegetables improve how your body handles insulin. And extra virgin olive oil activates the pathways that tell your body to actually start burning what's already stored. Layer consistent, moderate to vigorous exercise on top of that, and you're not just cutting calories anymore. You're sending your body a completely different set of signals, and that's what actually moves the needle on visceral fat specifically, not just weight in general. I know this is a lot of information, but you don't have to do all of it perfectly starting tomorrow. Pick 1 or 2 things from this list and start there. Add a handful of walnuts to your breakfast. Swap your cooking oil for extra virgin olive oil. Try growing your own broccoli sprouts. Add 2 brisk walks to your week and build from there. Small, consistent changes compound faster than most people expect, especially when you're targeting the actual biology behind visceral fat instead of just chasing a number on a scale. All right, that's the protocol. I hope this gave you a clearer, more actionable way to think about visceral fat
with the right
and what
kind of
actually works
movement,
to get rid of it.
something interesting
Stay
happens.
healthy, and I'll
The
see
results
you in
become
the next
dose
one.
dependent.